Okay, so the mic is on now. So can you all hear me?
Yeah.
We're good? Great. And are we officially at 9 o'clock?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this is just too surreal. Welcome to Derry Presbyterian Church. I am Pam Whitenack. I am going to be speaking about how Derry celebrated its anniversaries over the last 125 years, because unfortunately Derry's records from its first almost 2 centuries were destroyed in a fire back in the 1890s. So let's get started here. So Derry had, of the records that we have, the very first one we have is their 200th, which took place in 1924. There was a lot to celebrate at the church. In 1884, just 30 years earlier, the church rolls showed, just a handful, and I mean handful, 5, maybe 6 adult members, though there was a very thriving church school. The old Derry church that you can see here in the big picture, and you might get some sense of how dilapidated that building was, actually had been torn down in 1883 because it was structurally unsound. You can get a sense at these other pictures that are a little bit smaller on the side. The building needed to be torn down. It was just in terrible shape. And given the limited resources of a church that had, 5 adult members, it would not have been surprising if Derry had just ceased to exist about that time. But there were many in the larger community stretching into Harrisburg and Lebanon that really believed that Derry needed to be saved. It was the oldest church in our region, or oldest Protestant church in our region. And there were influential and wealthy Presbyterians both in Harrisburg and Lebanon, as well as descendants of Reverend John Elder, who to this day still have a very special attachment to this church, that offered funds that underwrote the bulk of the construction costs. And so additional donations came from fellow Presbyterian church and wealthy individuals who just believed in Derry's potential and that as a historic site needed to be saved. And if you go up in the chapel, which is the building that was built in 1884, you'll see almost all of the stained glass windows were donated by individuals or by Sunday schools of other Presbyterian church. It's really fun to go and read the inscriptions that are attached to each of those stained glass windows. The construction of the chapel also solidified sort of the date that we're going to use to identify our founding date. And on the chapel cornerstone, it reads, "To the glory of God, founded 1724, rebuilt 1884, and then, of course, Derry Presbyterian Church." Because in the earliest records of Presbytery, there's a lot of, there's a floating date out there. Some say that, as early as 1720, Presbyterians were gathering, near this site, not on this site. Some say 1722, some say 1728. But the members of the church at that time in 1884 said, this is our start date, and we have used that ever since. And even with the construction of the chapel, so here it is. This is the picture that I was showing you on the title page, but in a more full image. Derry's continued to struggle. There was not a called pastor between 1895 and 1909. There was just a series of what we would call stated supply pastors that had, had full-time calls at other churches, particularly Middletown Church. came over to do afternoon and evening services on Sunday. So they would, and you have to really appreciate that kind of contribution that, they'd already put in a full day's work on Sunday, and then they came over here because they really believed in their mission. So, but in 1895, there still were only 5 members, though the Sunday school included 88 students. So you get to see that, Derry's got some sway and a potential here in this community. But really, it's not until Milton Hershey comes back to this area in 1903, and what happened to my image? There it is, sorry. And the construction of the chocolate company and the development of the community of Hershey, that's going to create Derry's real opportunity to grow and thrive. So here we are, 1924. By that date, Derry membership had grown to 148 members, which is pretty remarkable. You started at 5, and then just, 30 years later, you're up to 148 members, and there were 156 people attending Sunday school. And Derry, I said, got his first, sort of full-time pastor in 1909, but in 1916, Reverend Robert Taylor, was called, and he's really a very powerful and very enthusiastic pastor, really nurtured this congregation. But so the celebration took place in 1924. By our current standards, very modest celebration. It was just over one weekend during the June 20th to June 22nd in 1924. And basically, it was several worship services beginning on Friday evening, and each service had a different focus. So at the Friday evening service, Reverend Taylor gave a sketch of the church's history, which he's then going to later expand and have printed as Derry's 205th anniversary in 1929. There were not so much people coming to be a part of these worships, but representatives from Newcastle Presbytery, we were still part of Newcastle Presbytery at that time, sent greetings. The congregation also read written reminiscences from several former pastors. Reverend Robinson, who was one of the stated supplies over 1905 to 1906. Reverend Segelkin, who was a called pastor but was only here for like a year and a half from 1909 to 1910. Then Reverend Clarence Gee, who was another stated supply for the year of 1912. And Reverend George Rentz, who was a called pastor, had very fond and positive connections with our church even after he left. And he serves here from 1913 to 1916. But you can get a sense there's a lot of disruption and a lot of upheaval in the church during the early decades or the first decade or so of the 20th century, just because the pastors are always changing, and we've had that experience, and we were really fortunate in that we had tremendous professional staff, still here guiding us and leading us. And you can just imagine a church that's trying to get off the ground, having a pastor change every year or so would have been, a big challenge. And then the weekend also, of course, was marked by the return of former members and descendants of former pastors and just friends of Derry. And while the events were focused on worship, it actually was very well covered by the press, both in Hershey and in Harrisburg. And now, while it wasn't part of the public worship and anniversary celebration, 1924 also included the construction of Derry's first manse, which gives you a sense of the stability of the church by this point, that they are financially stable enough to be able to underwrite the cost of constructing this manse. And this is, of course, a much later picture. It's actually right before the manse will get torn down in the 1990s to make way for the sanctuary's expansion. And also I think a manse at that time is a real sign of the commitment to the future. So that was a really positive thing. And Reverend Taylor is the first pastor, he and his family, to live in the manse. Well, Derry seemed to really enjoy a celebration, so they had another one in 2005. I think particularly Reverend Taylor and his interest in Derry's history just sparked sort of a series of anniversary celebrations. And the 2005 was a very similar kind of celebration, series of worships over the weekend, over in sort of the same time period, June 15th and 16th in 1929. And in addition, Reverend Taylor wrote Derry's first account of its history. And there's actually a couple versions of that. I put out some items, just a very light scattering of items that we can find in our historical records here at Derry. And for this weekend celebration, the 205th in 1929, some of the former pastors actually attended and actually participated in worship rather than just simply sending letters. And I wonder if that was that maybe there was a little more lead time, maybe that, we don't know, but maybe the 1924, the 200th anniversary was sort of done, you know, they woke up in March and said, it's our 200th anniversary, maybe we should do something. And then the pastors didn't have time to arrange their schedule, because some of the pastors are coming from a distance. One of the pastors, Jan, who lived in Ohio and came back, I can't think of who that was, but yeah. So, and the local pastors, they invited other Protestant pastors to come and participate as well, and they offered greetings from their individual congregations. And on the back of the celebration bulletin, because they just had one bulletin for the entire weekend, there was actually an appeal there to start building their history, since so much had been destroyed in the fire. Our records had been being stored over at Paxton Church in their manse because our church was so dilapidated. And the manse caught fire, and all of our early records, our session minutes, and who knows what else was there, maybe some photographs, were all lost in this fire. So we lost, other than the information that we have that's found in presbytery records, our resources for the 18th and 19th century are incredibly limited. So they were saying, you know, do you have anything? You know, please send it to the church, and we'll take care of it. And I have no idea what materials came in at that time. And over the years, we've continued to seek out images of our former pastors. Sometimes, particularly in the late 19th and very early 20th century, it can be pretty hard to find. Photography was not as ubiquitous as it is today. So I feel like this was part of the start of our church archives. The anniversary also created a great opportunity to include an appeal for contributions to the John Elder Memorial Chapel Fund. By, 1929, they're already imagining they're growing so fast, Derry's growing so fast, that the chapel, the original 1884 chapel, is becoming too small. And so they had pretty grandiose visions of what they might do. And in our archives, there's lots of materials about what they envisioned, their plans. And then in the fall of 1929, the stock market's going to crash. We're going to start heading into the Great Depression. So there's some refurbishment that's done to the chapel in that 1929 period before the market crashes. But all those physical construction expansions have to be put on hold. But they're already thinking to the future. So, again. Why did you do that? That was interesting. Okay, let's try this again. I don't know why well, that's really weird. Hold on, so sorry. Somehow. Keynote. What's wrong here? Let's try this one. Well, we'll just open this one. So sorry. So, any questions while I wait for this to do its thing?
I have one.
Okay.
Is there any record during the early years, 1905 to 1915, of either Mr. or Mrs. Hershey contributing anything to the church?
Yes, and we're just about to talk about that.
I'm sorry.
Yay, good segue, Bill, thank you. And though it was not officially part of the church's anniversary celebration, that 205th anniversary, the session house, which you can see here, are not glassed. In the, this is like if we're standing on the driveway coming into the church, and the chapel's over here on this side here, and then you can see the wall for the cemetery. So that's just to orient you a little bit. The chapel was enclosed with its glass structure that year, thanks to Milton Hershey, and I think some pretty quick thinking by Reverend Taylor. And that we have in the Hershey Community Archives, there's a 1955 interview with Harry Erdman, who was head of the Hershey Nursery. And I think that provides some clues and a little bit of our history. And in the interview, Mr. Erdman relates a story where he and Mr. Hershey were on the church grounds to look at some old trees. And this is an excerpt from the interview. And he said, "We were up there, Derry Presbyterian Church, one morning looking over some of the old trees to see what had to be done in order to preserve the trees." One of the deals that the church had with Milton Hershey was when Milton Hershey came here to build his chocolate factory, he needed water for the factory. And so the chocolate company started leasing the water of the Derry Spring, which is on our property. And in exchange for that lease and some other things, Milton Hershey agreed to maintain the grounds of Derry Presbyterian Church. And that went on for decades. It's really remarkable. So they're up there looking at some old trees to see what had to be done in order to preserve the trees. In looking over these trees to decide what to do with them, the pastor came out, that's Reverend Taylor, and asked him, Milton Hershey, about contributing to the Historical Society for the preservation of this building, meaning the session house. And Mr. Hershey said, "Well, what's it going to cost?" Well, Reverend Taylor, didn't have any idea. He thought $5,000, $10,000. Mr. Hershey said, "Well, I've seen a building like that over in France somewhere. I don't recall just where it was. They had the whole thing enclosed in glass. I'll get our architect here and see what we can do about it. We won't give it to the Historic Society." Now, is there anything else you can think of? Because they're talking about the Dauphin County Historic Society at that point. "No," Reverend Taylor said. "I appreciate that very much, Mr. Hershey. Mr. Hershey said to me," meaning Harry Erdman, "you talk to him and let me know." And Mr. Hershey said, "We'll take care of it. Now come on, Erdman, let's get out of here before we get stuck for something else." So the next anniversary that the church is going to celebrate is the 210th. And they were really on a roll here. Every 5 years they were looking to celebrate. So the 210th anniversary celebration, again, was a modest one. There were morning and evening worships. And sorry. And on June 24th, and the presbytery stated clerk preaching at the evening service. And then on Monday, the Presbytery of Carlisle, we're now part of Carlisle's, the Carlisle Presbytery, held its meeting in Derry. And so elders and deacons are encouraged to attend the Presbytery luncheon to help welcome the guests and to the church. And then the 210th anniversary concluded with a Monday evening service. And Reverend Andrew Blackwood, who was a professor at Princeton Seminary, preached at that service. The 1934 was also the 50th anniversary of the chapel, an event that was celebrated during Sunday school on September 16th, 1934. And what I find fascinating is that the Sunday school is very powerful and a major player within the church, and they're having their own celebrations regularly apart from the churches, because they really, in many ways, held the church up while the church, in terms of membership, was really struggling. Think about 5 adult members, 88 people in the Sunday school. So Debbie?
There was a whole thing called the Sunday school movement that was very distinct from worship and everything else. And they had rallies and all kinds of things. So that's why Sunday school ran a lot of things. It's a separate entity than a church.
So Debbie Hogue is saying, and she should know, being our Christian Ed director for many, many years, that during that time period, there was a Sunday school association, and they are having, national conventions and, rallies. And over on the table, there's a picture. It's a really fun picture. It's very long, and it shows everyone. It's their 45th anniversary celebration, and it's everyone in the Sunday school. On the side, it's a really cool picture because it's on the side of the chapel that it gets constructed on. So it's a rare view of the chapel that we don't have anywhere else. So you get to see all the stained glass windows that were on that side. So those of you in the room, take a look at it after I finish speaking, and we'll find opportunities to share it in the future. So the next sort of significant anniversary that the church is going to recognize is the 225th in 1949. And as the years went on, anniversary celebrations would continue that pattern established. There was a focus on worship and visiting former pastors to participate in worship. Well, Reverend Longbreak, Derry's pastor at the time, had a deep interest in the church's colonial history, and he, for the 1949 anniversary, he organized a service for the dedication of the cemetery's Revolutionary War grave markers. So, and why am I'm just like, sorry. I'm missing something, so sorry. Oh, this is it. There we go. Held on Sunday, October 30th, so it's totally separate from the church's own anniversary celebration that'll take place in another month or so. The dedication was held in 2 parts. In Sunday afternoon, there was a dedication program that you can sort of get a sense of here in the cemetery, and the church involved and invited the chair and president of the Pennsylvania Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. The Hershey Industrial School Band provided patriotic music, and Boy Scout Troop number 65, not the troop that is part of our church today, advanced the colors and placed markers on the graves of the 39 Revolutionary War soldiers that are buried in our cemetery. And then there was a dedications worship service held in the chapel that evening. Now, Derry's anniversary celebration was held several weeks later during the first week of December. And history and worship, again, are the focus of the celebration, and there's, of course, several special worship services held with opportunities for the congregation, the community, and the presbytery to celebrate with Derry. Reverend Corbin, that you see here, Derry's pastor from 1932 to 1940, returned to preach at the Sunday worship. So, but on the schedule that you see here, that was, you know, sort of an advertising little postcard, you know, you can see it's all taking place just in, you know, 1 week, starting from December 4th, going to December 11th, Sunday to Sunday. And most of the things that are taking place are on one of the Sundays. So, where am I? Okay. So on the, and this is photographs from the Sunday worship in 1949, and you can see standing here is Reverend Longbreak, and his little daughter is standing next to him, which I always think is really sweet. And then the photo on the right is all the sort of the leaders of the celebration, those that made all the arrangements. So I love the addition of the children in there. So you get a little glimpse of part of the congregation at that time. Now, Derry Sunday School also, again, had a special anniversary worship service, and they were celebrating the 55th anniversary of the Sunday School. And past Sunday School superintendents and present superintendents were honored at the celebration. Okay. So, and you know, there was a children's chapel in the lower level of the chapel, the extended chapel building. And I'm trying to think. This room is part of it. What do you think, Jan? Is this part of this room part of it? But within the chapel building, the Christian education extension hasn't been built, and of course the sanctuary hasn't been built. But within that building, there was a children's chapel that the Sunday school had, you know, weekly, you know, small worships there as part of the Sunday school experience. But the anniversary again served as an opportunity to begin promoting plans to expand the church. And there were some really grandiose visions for that included actually what looks like would have been our sanctuary. So, but they were going to build it all at once in 1950. And there are several newspaper organizations, newspapers that published articles there that about, you know, Derry's plans to expand. And while Derry would expand the church building, you can get a sense here of the actual construction was much more modest than what they had initially envisioned. So it included some classrooms and a new kitchen and social hall. So where we are now in room 7 was part of that 1951 expansion, because this room here was the social hall, and room 6, yeah, and so it's a totally different building. It's hard to sometimes put all the pieces together, because the building has grown and morphed, and, you know, additions made, and then additional additions made to better connect the buildings together. So to try and imagine what part came when sometimes is a real challenge for me. So we get to our really big celebration, the 250th anniversary in 1974. And Derry is growing in the particularly in the starting in the 1950s, but really going gangbusters in the 1960s and 70s. And as a result, I think, and also just changing, you know, ideas about celebrations really come out in this 250th anniversary. So the 250th is going to be a much more elaborate, it's a year-long celebration. They have too many ideas, too much that they think that they want to celebrate. It can't be all fit into just a single week. And also, I think it's made possible by the fact that Derry's staff has expanded. In 1971, Derry hired its first full-time director of music, who was Herb Fowler, who was a man with enormous talent and energy and creativity, and also first full-time director of Christian Ed, who was Nancy. Today we know her as Nancy Reinert, and she is still. After her retirement, they have come back to Derry, so she's a member of our church today. And with this additional full-time staff, Derry took the opportunity to find new ways to celebrate its history. And there were special events virtually every month during 1974. And I think also that the nation's upcoming bicentennial that would be celebrated in 1976 also contributed to Derry's desire to celebrate its colonial past. And it's not surprising that Derry marketed the celebration as its bicentennial, even though it was more than a bicentennial. But that fervor in the 1970s about the nation coming close to its 200th anniversary kind of infected us all during that time period. And so plans included, of course, special Sunday worship services with former pastors helping to lead worship. But instead of trying to do several worships over the course of one weekend, each of these special worships would take place on a different month. So it was sort of spread out. And on January 5th, to kick the year off, did I miss this? I'm sorry. This is the sanctuaries it looks in 1966. For the 250th kickoff event, a special worship, they asked William Blair, Reverend William Blair, who was Derry's pastor from 1950 to 1959, to return to preach during worship. And then we started picking up momentum. In February, featured a covered dish supper. So this is not upstairs in our fellowship hall, but this is in this room that was known as our social hall. And you can imagine that you really had to be committed to attend these things because it was not the easiest room to get to. So there's a covered dish dinner, and those of you who are older members might recognize that there's Bob Owens sitting right at the end of the table, and you all may be able to recognize some other people that I don't recognize. But it's kind of fun to see everyone there. And it was a covered dish stuff. This was modest. This was the Derry Church provided the meat, and you were asked to bring a covered dish to share. So that was a very strong tradition, particularly in the 60s and 70s and 80s, for churches to have, always to have covered dish suppers. And then afterwards, there was a historical presentation by Reverend William Schwame, who was a retired Presbyterian minister who liked to write a lot about Presbyterian history in this area. I would not recommend him as an authoritative source, but he liked to write a lot. There's many books that he has written, but I would not use them as an authoritative source. But I'm sure he was very entertaining, because his books are very entertaining. But there was also a display of some of Derry's historical artifacts, papers and booklets and photographs. And what was really wonderful, I think, was that several women of all ages volunteered to come dressed in clothing that would reflect changing styles over the last century. So it looks like they mostly got the younger members of Derry's female population. So that was February. I don't think, there wasn't anything in March. April was Easter. And then in May, Derry invited Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, who was a liberal Republican, to speak during Sunday worship. And why? I have no idea. And Jan, who did you say knew Senator Hatfield?
Sally Pierce.
So Sally Pierce.
Dr. Pierce and Sally.
Dr. and Sally Pierce apparently knew Senator Hatfield and invited him, and he came. But there was no other real. It was interesting because this region, this part of Pennsylvania, tends to be fairly conservative politically, and Senator Hatfield was known to be a very liberal Republican. And so, but we also know that the pastor in 1974 was Reverend Ira Reed. And Reverend Reed also was probably a strong liberal Republican as well. So in terms of political ideology, there was a good match there. Okay. And then one of our favorite things, traditions that continues to today, in June, Derry invited former members to return for worship and a homecoming picnic. And in front, you have Jack and Marianne Zerby and their daughters. And I'm sure there are other people that we might recognize as well in this picture. One of the big events for the year was managed and sponsored by the Women's Association. So on the weekend of September 6th and 7th, the Women's Association sponsored a sale of colonial crafts that Derry women had spent the entire, literally I think the entire year creating. The women met monthly to craft items that recalled earlier generations and to help, because many of these women were stay-at-home moms. There was childcare provided each month so that the women could come and have someone to care for their children while they worked on preparing items for sale. And some of the items included things like pine cone candle rings and wreaths, rag dolls, corn husk dolls, herb and tea sachets with herbs that they were growing in their garden. And to craft, but then they needed all these, supplies. And so they collected egg cartons, Christmas cards, used flash cubes. Remember the cameras that you had the little cube that had 4 flashes on it? So they were making something with ones that had been used. I have no idea what they were actually making. Spray can tops from toothpaste tubes, jar rings from like mason jars, odd pieces of brick, odds and ends of sewing, so scrap fabric and scrap trim and those kinds of things, styrofoam trays, and household. This is just blew my mind. Households were urged to collect meat drippings that would be used to craft candles. So here you can see them in the kitchen, which was down here, getting ready to make candles. So Charlie, it kind of reminded me of you telling me a story about Catherine, who would collect meat drippings, but then put them in the forest for the animals. I say, like, I can get behind that. I'm not sort of how I feel about meat drippings being in my candles, but. But they're very historic. The event was such a success that the Women's Association actually needed to continue to meet to craft additional items that had been ordered after the women ran out of their stock. So, but you can just imagine that the labor and energy that such an event took and how many women of the church had to be involved to make this an And the Women's Association then donated all their proceeds, and I think it was about $600, which is really remarkable when you think that they're making all these things from, you know, what some people might consider trash. And then it was donated to Mission. So really, a really remarkable effort, showing the, you know, just the power and energy of women in this church. October featured a Bach Festival choral concert, which was an augmented choir and sanctuary choir with soloists, both some soloists coming from the sanctuary choir, a couple soloists that were invited to sing with them. And there was not just a vocal, but there was a small chamber orchestra that accompanied the choir. And to wrap up the year-long celebration, this really blows my mind, Derry presented what was labeled a historical pageant. This is the cover of the program for the pageant. The script was written by Gwen Myers, and there was a musical score of 13 movements that was composed by our director of music, Herb Fowler. And there's a record over on the table that was, the recording was made, I think about, either it was 1976 or 1977. And on the record, there's a recording of one of the pieces that Herb had written, "O God, beneath your guiding hand." This production required the involvement of about 150 people, either behind the scenes, building scenery, handling and operating lights, or just working on the stage crew. And then on stage, there are dozens of actors who are telling the story of Derry's history in 7 different scenes. And the show also featured a multimedia presentation. It just must have been an amazing production. I would have loved to have seen it. I believe we have a reel-to-reel audio recording of the presentation, but that kind of video didn't exist at that time. And what I find most amazing about this ambitious year-long celebration is that they're not the only things that are taking place at Derry during that year. Derry had a committee called the Vesper Series, and they're not just bringing in talent, they are putting on full-scale productions throughout the year. And so they're preparing and they're presenting other performances during the year. The youth group also presented 2 performances that year. One was a spring drama called Eyes Upon the Cross. It was presented not just to Derry, but also to a few other churches in town. And then in the fall, they produced the play Our Town. The corn roast was held in August. The moderator of the General Assembly preached in September, but that wasn't listed as one of the anniversary celebration items. You know, it was just like, oh, yeah, sure, come and preach to us. So I want to stop in 1974 because Debbie's going to talk about a part of the 1999 celebration, our 275th. And so I want to let her give you sort of an introduction because, you know, it was even, I think, many ways, you know, even bigger and more exciting, more opportunities, different kinds of celebrations that were part of the 275th. And so I'll talk about the 275th that took place in 1999 in 2 weeks. Debbie's going to speak about the travel that Derry did as part of our 275th anniversary celebration. And then I'll come back and sort of fill in all the other things that we did during that year. But what I also want to do is spend a little bit of time, and hopefully this will be much more interactive. We'll have to talk to Sue George about how to facilitate that, to seek ideas about how we might celebrate our 300th anniversary, which is going to be in 2024, so in 3 years from now. It's my hope that we will not only look back and celebrate who we have been and who we are today, but also what we might aspire to be in the future. And so I hope that you will come to share your thoughts and ideas then. So I think that's all I have to say. That's all I have to say. So I'm going to stop the video recording because it's really complicated to, I guess if you have questions, I can repeat them and share with the people that are listening, but maybe they've all vanished. So any questions, comments? Charlie, were you here then?
No, I didn't come until the 1980s.
Okay. So, so you were here?
I was not here.
You were not
but
here.
I'm sure that whether some or all of your buildings have been placed on the National Register.
The session house is on the National Register. I don't. Is the chapel on the National Register? I don't believe. Just the session house. Then the cemetery also is part of the National Register.
It might be important in the future to consider that, because I believe that as part of the capital plans of the present administration, there may be funds available for buildings that are on the register that won't be available if you're not.
Okay.
And so we might want to consider.
That's a good idea. We'll look into that. Thank you. Okay, Jack, I think we're done.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. So take a look at some of there's some fun photos there.